This is Mae Brussell, and this is the beginning of World Watchers, shifting from the talk show to World Watchers. It's broadcast number 607, and here's another month gone by. I get an exclamation. I can't believe it. July is gone. July 25th, 1983. Another month has gone. It seems like it's one day, and we have another month tucked away. A year ago this evening, July 26th, a year ago and one night, I was talking about Fritz Kramer and Henry Kissinger, and hail to the chief or heil to the chief. You know how we begin these programs with a resume. What were we doing and saying 1 year ago today? There was a meeting at the Bohemian Club, as there is this week, and when Henry Kissinger appeared, they played the particular song for the President of the United States, Hail to the Chief. And Henry Kissinger got up to speak as the band played, and he said, no, I'm just Henry Kissinger. Do you think he was in oblivion forever? Do you think that he would never be seen again? Do you believe that a year ago from now he could be a president of the United States? That the Congress could change the Constitution, which they want to do, so foreign-born Henry Kissinger can become president? If you think that's far off, listen to the broadcast I did 10 years ago that Ronald Reagan would be president. I was talking about the murders in El Salvador, the whitewash of a murder. There were over 1,000 murders this last month. I was talking about Fritz Kramer, the man behind Fritz Kramer, Henry Kissinger. And I wrote to Israel, to the Yad Vashem, V-A-S-E-H-M, asking where the Nazi war criminal Fritz Kramer went after the war. The archives in Israel keep extensive records of war criminals. He was in the docket at Dachau trial. They said in 2 sentences, we have no record of Fritz Kramer, and neither does the Stanford Institute, as we said before. I talked about the Bay of Pigs and Alexander Haig, another protege of Kramer, and their link to the Kennedy assassination, and the turmoil in London, the shooting of Mr. Argoff, A-R-G-O-F, that was the excuse for the invasion of Lebanon. He survived that, and 1 year later, he had a press conference last week, and after surviving that assault and almost died, and said he didn't approve of the invasion of Lebanon. They shot him in London as the excuse to go into Lebanon, and obviously he was against the policy of Mr. Begin and the warmongers in Israel. I talked about Edwin Wilson and his bail, and how he had hired assassins and wanted to hire more assassins involved with his trial. This week, Edwin Wilson's name came up. As I mentioned before, last week, Bob Gray, who had an office with Edwin Wilson in the CIA, runs a part of the Ronald Reagan administration of publicity and so forth, and Bob Gray was one of the names on the memo 1 year later that surfaced that was helping coach Ronald Reagan to become president, Mr. Wilson's partner in intelligence in Washington, D.C. I also talked about the problems with the Vatican and Roberto Calvi's hanging in London and the effect it was having on international banks, and Alfred Bloomingdale and how his money dried up for Vicki Morgan, and we'll do more on that later. And Roy Cohn was hired as an attorney for Alfred Bloomingdale, I said a year ago, and then it turns out that he runs right away to Monte Carlo, where he's with the father of the attorney of Prince Rainier, and Rainier is soon to become a widower, and his wife will die in September, the same day as Bashir Jamal. I talked about the money that dried up when Calvi was hung, and how a lot of people would be chasing and running because they wouldn't have their money. Now I'm going into a new plan with this broadcast and with the tapes that accompany it, people that take it by subscription, and the sheets that go with this broadcast. Many of you know, and some of you don't know, that if you send me self-addressed stamped envelopes, I will mail to you the day after Tuesday or Wednesday of each week the bibliography of information that I have on the program. I started that back in 1978. I'd been on the air 7 years, and there was so much information and people needed it for research and so forth that I decided to have this sheet go out. And I might have mentioned this on the air. There's a fellow up in the Bay Area where these broadcasts are played who has a mind, I guess, similar to mine and other researchers, and he started charting out the connecting links of various names that I put on the air because they go so fast. And he started mailing me diagrams of these particular names as he interpreted by listening and taping the broadcasts off the air up there and putting them together. And it's the way I think, and I believe that maybe I should take each week, as the broadcast is completed, the names that I have and the dates and the people that relate to each other, because it is a well-prepared program. It sounds casual, but there's a lot of work here. And make the connecting links. And then someday if I talk about Vicki Morgan or Vincent Bugliosi or Melvin, Belli, or Jane Mansfield, you can refer to that sheet and not just look at the name or the article that you don't have, but you will have a connecting diagram. And maybe at the end of the year, I'll get a book out and go back and do some of the back broadcasts so that you see the connections. So this week, I charted out what I had on the air last week because there were so many names, and it was a very complicated broadcast, as they all are. I think they are. It calls a lot of your attention span for an hour, and some of the names are new to you. So I'm going to tell you about the chart so that I can clarify what I said last week, because it's not a subject that's going to go away, and it progresses on. It has a past and it has a future, and I'll tell you how it is charted. Now, for those of you who get these sheets, when I read a newspaper article, I color code them with dots, and if somebody in the course of the article has died, a witness, or somebody is murdered, I put a black dot, and that tells me that there was a death involved. There was an article in the LA Times this week about 2 vice presidents of the Bank of America who were charged with arson. And the lead article is that the vice presidents set fire to a building so they could have $10,000 insurance policy. But then you read further in the article, and 2 people were burned in the fire. They weren't charged with murder. So I put 2 black dots. That means 2 people died. The charge is arson, not murder. They're vice presidents of the Bank of America. So if you get these sheets and you see a dot, they all photocopy the same color, black, but this particular sheet has to do with people that were murdered. When I get home, I color code it green if I've had on the broadcast. Now, I'm going to run down just briefly again. This is repetition, but connecting lines so that you get it clear, and I'm going to try and do this for most of the broadcasts from now on, so you have the chart. And then also on the sheet, you'll have the sources of information. Usually, I was giving you the source of information for the idea and not drawing the links. Now you will have them both. So the broadcast, which I had last week that I want to enlarge this week, broadcast number 606, was on Vicki Morgan, called from Dallas, Texas in 1963 to Los Angeles, California in 1983, otherwise titled From the Motorcade to the Baseball Bat. Nixon, Kissinger, and Ronald Reagan are the winners. In this ball game, they're up to bat, and they're the winners. November 22nd, 1963, at the top of the chart, the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, which I described as a coup in the United States, a coup d'etat. Down below that is Jack Ruby. He kills Lee Harvey Oswald, the only suspect kept in the jail, to protect the assassins. That's November 24th, 1963, 2 days later. Below that is Melvin Belli, the attorney for Jack Ruby, whose purpose is to conceal the assassins. Then over to the right, I have the name Dorothy Kilgallen. She attended the trial of Jack Ruby and Melvin Belli. She said that she would get to the bottom of that case. It was the last thing she did. She was murdered in 1965. And underneath that, I have an arrow going down. Dorothy Kilgallen was a close friend of Jane Mansfield. In 1967, Jane Mansfield and attorney Sam Brody, a friend of hers, were killed near New Orleans on the way to Jim Garrison with files of the Jack Ruby, Melvin Belli, John Kennedy conspiracy. Now, over to the left of the Kilgallen, I have Jane Mansfield was also a close friend of Senator Robert Kennedy. She might have been going to New Orleans for Kennedy family. Mansfield was also doing this for Dorothy Kilgallen. So under Kilgallen, I have a Mansfield, and then I have also Robert Kennedy, the connecting links there. Now, under the Mansfield explanation of a relationship with Dorothy Kilgallen, below that is another arrow. Jane Mansfield going down to the Sharon Tate murders, because Jane Mansfield was up with Mr. LaVey doing the witchcraft thing with Susan Atkins of the Manson family and Charles Manson and Jane Mansfield and Sharon Tate. And these people were with Anton LaVey up in San Francisco, experimenting in the witchcraft element up in the Bay Area. In 1968, June 68, Jane Mansfield's friend, Senator Robert Kennedy, was killed. But the night he was killed, he had dinner with Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski before he went to the Ambassador Hotel. And Roman Polanski was an orphan whose parents died in Nazi Germany at Auschwitz. His mother died at Auschwitz and his father later. They were victims of concentration camps. And below that, after 1968, Robert Kennedy was killed and was close friends with Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski. And below that, the line goes down, and I call it the Beverly Hills Pogrom. Now, when I get over to the other side of it, Jack Ruby, he told Earl Warren and Gerald Ford that there would be a pogrom because of the things he did by killing Kennedy and covering up with Oswald. He suggested the Nazis, the fascists, would take over the country, and he wanted to tell Earl Warren and Leon Jaworski and Gerald Ford, poor schnook, he didn't know who he was talking to. A pogrom, incidentally, in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, is an organized massacre of helpless people, especially Jews. If you saw Fiddler on the Roof, there's a scene of pogroms where they come in and tear everything apart and cut people open. This was going on in Russia before the Russian Revolution, and then the Tsars left Russia and went to Germany and trained the Nazis, and the Nazis trained the special forces and people in the United States, the Minutemen and the Nazis that Manson worked along with. So 1 year after Robert Kennedy was killed, his friends, Sharon Tate was murdered. Roman Polanski was in London. Her baby was dead. She pleaded for it to live. And Mr. Frykowski and Abigail Folger and Jay Sebring and Steve Parent all killed. And August the 9th, Leno and Rosemary LaBianca were murdered the next night. Now, you see a lot of little dots there. There's 2, 4, 6, 8 people murdered in 2 days. The first clue below that, linking to the Kennedy assassination I mentioned last week, was Ed Butler, who wrote Hate Killed Tate, ? Blaming the blacks, which was a typical CIA Nazi party line, and he worked with the Minutemen and the Birch Society. Now, below that is Helter Skelter, written in blood to be associated with the Beatles, and then an arrow pointing down that the murders made Vincent Bugliosi famous. He prosecuted the case, covered up the Los Angeles Police Department, and also Peter Pitches of the Sheriff Department, the CIA. As the prosecutor, he covers up the people behind the murders and then writes a book and gets money for the book. And besides getting money for the book, Vincent Bugliosi can smear the Beatles. And we'll get to that, what happens. You know what falls with John Lennon in 1980. Now, that is the part of Jane Mansfield, common denominator with Dorothy Kilgallen, the Ruby trial, and Robert Kennedy, the Sharon Tate, Roman Polanski family, the use of cover stories to smear the blacks and the hippies. Now, of course, Dorothy Kilgallen, as I mentioned last week, was a close friend of Jane Mansfield and Sam Brody, who were killed on their way to Jim Garrison. And in January 1967, before they went to New Orleans, Jack Ruby was dead. He had that 3-week cancer after he warned about the Nazi pogroms that would happen in the United States. And I diagrammed this from the broadcast last week, that from the Jane Mansfield Sam Brody murder, the law office of Sam Brody was shared by Robert K. Steinberg, who appears and surfaces with those alleged tapes that are supposed to exist of people going right up to the White House of the President of the United States and his closest friends and a member of Congress and 2 appointed persons on the Reagan administration part of that. Now, Sam Brody inherits the office, so I assume he inherits the tapes. And I said before, he graduated from Loyola Law School, which is funded by Patrick Frawley. Ed Butler worked for him, Army intelligence, and worked in New Orleans in military intelligence with Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, a diagram going below Sam Brody and Robert K. Steinberg, is that Steinberg becomes the law partner of Melvin Belli, Jack Ruby's attorney, and he also was a lawyer for a while with F. Lee Bailey, Associated Bailey, who covers the DIA and the CIA cases from Boston to California across the world. Now, 10 years later, 1973 to 83, Steinberg is the law partner of Vincent Bugliosi, who is going to become well-known and famous, smearing the Lennons. And in fact, the index of his book mentions the Beatles about 8 or 10 times. He represents Virginia Graham, the main prosecution witness in the Manson case, always protecting the Texas killer Charles Watson. They don't call it the Watson massacres, they call it the Manson. And for a while, Steinberg wants to get into the DeLorean case, but Joseph Ball of the Warren Commission is already on that one and assigned to that one. Then Vincent Bugliosi, as I say, smears the Beatles. He uses the title of the Beatles' music for his book to associate it with that terrible crime. And then by December the 8th of 1980, John Lennon is murdered, with links of Mark David Chapman to the same espionage establishment in DeKalb County, Georgia, that works with the Los Angeles Police Department today. Not yesterday, but today through Western Goals. Alfred Bloomingdale, working for the CIA committee, is dead in August of 1982, and Vicki Morgan is dead July 8, 1983. Robert Steinberg, the common denominator, is the first person to go to the jail of the assailant Marvin Pancoast. He gives him some dimes. Pancoast calls a woman who delivers these tapes to Steinberg. And then in the sheet with the diagrams, I put a few more connecting coincidences that Vicki Morgan had a lawsuit in 1977, and Paul Caruso was her attorney. Caruso was the attorney for Susan Atkins of the Manson case, and if you look up the index of Helter Skelter, you'll see the references. The second name that is in both the Kennedy assassination and the Manson is Lawrence Schiller, the journalist who is close to Paul Caruso, Vicki Morgan's attorney, and the Susan Atkins attorney, and Richard Caballero. Lawrence Schiller was the man who was selected to be with Jack Ruby. As soon as he got that 3-week cancer and his sister saw him bloated up, he was taken to Parkland Hospital, and nobody could see him except Lawrence Schiller. He's sort of the vulture of these cases. He also was one of the last people to write about her with Lenny Bruce, who was talking about the Kennedy assassination in the nightclubs in Los Angeles, and write about Janis Joplin and other LAPD hits. You see these famous authors, Schiller or Bugliosi, they take these cases, and it happens with the John Kennedy assassination too, and they divert it to another place, like turn it around with some facts that are true, and then spin the answers and the conclusions off. And Lawrence Schiller is great at that. And so he was a journalist that worked with Paul Caruso, Sue Atkins, and he worked with Jack Ruby, and he also was involved with the Manson family, writing and being with the main characters involved with those murders of Sharon Tate and the other people. Another person whose name came out in the news this week was Cary Grant. Vicki Morgan dated, and I'll go into that, the King of Morocco, Faisal, for several years, and was with Bernie Cornfeld and Cary Grant. Cary Grant is one of these people like Grace Kelly that weaves in and out of every scene of Monte Carlo, Hollywood, London, the who's who of what's what. Cary Grant was one of Vicki Morgan's associates or contacts. Now, there was a story, and somebody who maybe takes these broadcasts or hears it can remind me of the source, but the night that Sharon Tate was murdered and all the people who were murdered, Cary Grant was at the home of the caretaker earlier in the evening. He wasn't there when all the murders took place, and at first the police arrested William Garretson, Garretson, because there were these screams of 5 people being slain, and not a sound. He was right there on the grounds in a home. And he said, well, I had the stereo on or something, some feeble excuse. But Cary Grant was visiting him that evening before the murders took place. And then Cary Grant is later associated or dating or traveling with or being with Vicki Morgan as one of her entourage. Now, the Sharon Tate murders took place in 1969, and Vicki Morgan, who was fairly young, 17, allegedly met Alfred Bloomingdale on Hollywood Boulevard at Schwab's, or the vegetarian restaurant on Sunset Boulevard. That's where they were supposed to have met. she goes right from there to this large estate up in the Hollywood Hills where all these shenanigans and sadomasochism is going on. And now I wonder, with the Kings and the entourage that she had and the people she was with, if she wasn't even already selected for Alfred Bloomingdale to pick her up at that place. He was an established person and the heir to the Bloomingdale department stores, and the family's well known, and goodness knows what his links were closely to Ronald Reagan through all these years. And we're talking about 1969 when Reagan was governor. This was a political scene, and here's Vicki up with all these people and seems to interweave the writers, the lawyers. She had a lot in common with the whole scene. And again, as I say, Ed Butler worked with Lee Harvey Oswald, and then he, in New Orleans, in military intelligence, helped make that record, I Am a Marxist, and then he's writing about the Sharon Tate case to try to smear the blacks. Remember, in the control of Candy Jones, one of the first things the CIA did was to train her to hate blacks and Italians and Jews and identify their smells or their noises or whatever. So that was part of the program in training you to become a CIA agent. So we don't know, how intricate the Manson story was. He was a student of Mein Kampf and Adolf Hitler, as was Mr. Hinckley before he shot Ronald Reagan. He traveled with the Nazi Party and Posse Comitatus in the same group as the Manson family, and Hinckley had the same background. Now, I talked to Paul Krasner today. The realists are for sale. Why was Martha Mitchell kidnapped? And the Senate Select Committee is part of the cover-up, and the SLA is the CIA. And the first time I met Paul, he was doing investigation into the case of Charles Manson, and he asked me, what do you know about Manson? And I had so much information about the Manson family, and we became friends, and that was in 1972. So I asked him if he was following the Vicki Morgan case and the links to the law office of Steinberg with Vincent Bugliosi and the overlapping of these various people that seemed to touch Vicki's life as well as the Manson family. And he gave me the address of 2 places where you can write, and I'll give you those addresses to follow up on information about the Manson family and Vicki Morgan and maybe the interconnecting links. One is a newspaper in San Francisco called Appeal to Reason, and Paul Krasner just wrote an article for them. It's 495 Ellis Street, and if you don't have a pencil, you can call me at home and get that, or write to me and get it. 495 Ellis Street, number 237, apartment or office number 237, San Francisco, 94102. And as for volume 1, number 12, it's 50 cents for the Paul Krasner article, and you may want to subscribe. They're doing investigative work on Marvin Pancoast and Vicki Morgan. And the other address is LA Weekly, J. Levin, Levin, 5325 Sunset Boulevard, LA 90027. Now, in the course of his researching the Manson family, he was aware of the fact and wrote about in these articles that the Los Angeles Police Department confiscated tapes of the Sharon Tate family, and I knew for years that there were tapes there of their shenanigans, and the Los Angeles police was selling them. And I'm just going to mention 2 cassettes. They're not for sale, but the police department was selling them, and people are familiar with the fact that they were taped. One is of Jane Wyman, Ronald Reagan's first wife, and Greg Bouncer, the attorney in Hollywood. Now, Greg Bouncer is the attorney for MGM, for ABC American Broadcasting, for Howard Hughes. He was the attorney for Howard Hughes. Kirk Kerkorian is MGM, and also Mr. Bronfman of Permandex, the assassination teams that involved Roy Cohn, and again, all of these people that each week I'll chart out for you. Allegedly in the home of Sharon Tate were some very personal tapes, shall we say, of Ronald Reagan's first wife with Greg Bouncer. No wonder Nancy Reagan doesn't talk to her. There's all these stories about fights in the White House and how she has nothing to do with Jane Wyman and she hates Jane Wyman. Maybe she was afraid that these things would surface at this time and rub off on Ronnie and ruin their great dream. You know, their dream to be the king and queen of America, which they finally got. Maybe there's something about Jane Wyman messing around with other people the LAPD has. I would like my ex-mate photographed and those things sold. So maybe she's got a good reason to be scared, you know? Then the other set of films Paul writes about, there's a whole lot of them. One is Mama Cass, that's Cass Elliot of the Mamas and Papas, Yul Brynner, Warren Beatty, and Peter Sellers having their little sex parties together. After Sharon Tate was murdered, they offered $10,000 reward to find out who killed Sharon Tate. And the Los Angeles Police Department has those tapes. But after that, Mama Cass was murdered in London, and Peter Sellers, I had believed for a long time, had been murdered. And he's off. Warren Beatty and Yul Brynner, of course, are around. But they offered $10,000 to find out who killed Sharon Tate. Now, the interesting thing, some of you might remember from earlier broadcasts, and some of you might not know, that I'm friendly with a sheriff who helped arrest the Manson family at the Spahn Ranch, and they rounded them all up, the pre-dawn raid with helicopters, police, and everything, took them all to the police department, then took them all out to the Barker Ranch in the Mojave. They weren't supposed to be picked up. The police department would have had the $10,000, but they didn't want it because they set up the whole thing. So they were in the custody of the police, and they were transferred to another safe house out in the Mojave at the Barker Ranch, where finally, through a fluke of talking and being careless and thinking they'd be protected, they were finally caught. While rewards were out for the killers, the Los Angeles police had them and nested them in another safe house out in the Mojave Valley. So you can order this LA Weekly and get that story and keep up with those items. Now, last week I was mentioning, or the week before, that the story of Vicki Morgan having to die is that she was so despondent, she didn't have any money, she was out of money, and yet they said she had another case pending in court that would have given her an income, which in fact did give her an income. And broadcast 605, that's July the 11th, I mentioned that February the 12th, 1982, Alfred Bloomingdale had made a written contract with Vicki Morgan for 10% of the Showbiz pizza place, and a written promise of $10,000 a month for 2 years, and then profits after that, money from there, and the checks came to her from Fort Lauderdale. This was from the LA Herald, a series of articles in September of 1982. She had this contract. Now, if you want to look more about the pizza place that she was partnered to, Fortune magazine has a long story, High Profits from a Weird Pizza Combination, and it's about Nolan Bushnell and a guy named Bob Brock, who was her partner. I mentioned Brock several weeks ago on the air. Fortune magazine has a article on the tremendous profits of the pizza business, and this is Fortune, July 26, 1982. So 1 year before she was murdered, she had 10% of this pizza business. I mentioned several people that weren't identified and that there were 90 restaurants and 300 franchises. Well, that wasn't just off the top of the hat, because a respectable magazine like Fortune magazine, 1 year before she's killed and the exact same time that she's made a partner with 10% of the business, is written up as a company that's going on the stock market, that they have 1,000 stores they wanted by 1985, and it goes into their business. They invested $225 million. And it also involved in 1978 the Warner Communications, and the Atari business sold the Bushnell the Pizza Time restaurant with the rights to promoting this, and it tells about the offices in Orlando, Florida, and the regions where they would put their pizza parlors in New Orleans, Oklahoma, Chicago, Detroit, Seattle, California, and they were going to promote Pizza Time and Showbiz Pizza. And she is a 10% partner, and even though she didn't win the palimony suit, they did make it clear that she was, in fact, a partner in this huge pizza business coming out of Texas, and it involves Pepsi-Cola and the Atari Warner Communications Group, which goes back again. I believe Gerald Ford is on the board of the Warner Communication. He is. It's a who's who of various people. In fact, I got a brochure this week on the Warner Communication Company. Incidentally, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal once a year run ads if you want to know about certain corporations, and you send for these books, and I sent for about 30 of them, and they're starting to come, and it tells you who's on the board of these various corporations. Like Beverly Sills is always with the far-right fascist group, and she's on the board of this Warner Communications, and there's people that you think are attending to their opera, and they're whining and dining with the worst fascists in the world. And you get this board of directors, and you get a little different view of what's going on. It is 8:30 now. We're going to take a break for 1 minute, and then we're going to come back with the second half of this broadcast. This is Mae Brussell, and it is side 2 of broadcast number 607. That's July 25th, 1983. And I'm talking about Vicki Morgan, but I'm talking about more than Vicki Morgan. She was a partner in a business deal, in a prosperous business deal. The excuse for her death was that she was broke or despondent. The judge hadn't thrown out the case. Her head was smashed with that baseball bat, and the implications are horrendous, and the people around her are very, very high up in government. I mentioned a few minutes ago about the pizza parlor business, that she had 10% in, that she had signed a written contract with the people involved, and I've mentioned it before on the program, and the article now in Fortune magazine. Just at the time she became a partner in the pizza business, in that particular business, it was very, very prosperous and still is. Now, there were other articles this week in the newspaper about Vicki Morgan. One was from the Star, July 26, 1983, and it tells about her arrangement with King Faisal. Remember last week we talked about her having a king, a particular king, for a lover. This article says that King Faisal of Morocco paid for Todd, her son's schooling. He took her to Paris, spent a lot of money on her, had 2 years together. This is at a time when she also was in touch with Alfred Bloomingdale, and the implications of blackmail for the United States government, or what she could know, are really horrendous. At the present time, Vernon Walters is a paid consultant and lobbyist for the government of Morocco. He also is the roving ambassador for Ronald Reagan for all of the fascist states, South America and elsewhere, and Argentina, and goes back and forth to various countries. He's a member of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, the CIA, the Defense Department. Vernon Walters is active with the royalty in Morocco, and evidently Vicki Morgan had inroads into that particular country. Vicki was afraid she would be killed. There were several articles about this. One said that William Morris Agency had her book and then backed out at the last minute. They got a call from the very highest possible quarters. Very high, the very highest, including naming the White House, is the way that Mr. Robert Steinberg referred to the tapes that he had going to the highest in the office. And this one article said that obviously President Reagan didn't want the story told that she was going to tell, and Vicki had said, they will do anything to keep me quiet, and they did. A call had come to the William Morris Agency, don't handle her book. Now, at the time that this was happening, a year ago, Marvin Pankos worked for William Morris Agency. The Los Angeles Police Department has a story out that it was a clear-cut murder case, and I've mentioned this before. If you walk in and turn in the weapon or tell them who you killed and where the weapon is, the conclusion is no conspiracy, and this one is really obvious, and the message should be loud and clear for people that want to pull that thing again and tell about their affairs with these prominent people. Now, Marvin Mitchelson, the attorney for Vicki Morgan, said last week that these tapes do exist. He knows they exist. He's heard from 2 confirmed sources of the existence of the tape, and evidently there's a lot of payoffs, a lot of blackmail going on, a lot of things could happen to hurt particularly the Ronald Reagan administration, but I'm not sure that George Bush and the CIA would be hurt by this. This, again, is like the Scotch tape getting Ronald Reagan out of office. And if Ronald Reagan, getting Richard Nixon out of office, rather, and if Ronald Reagan's out of office, we have the exhumed Henry Kissinger, hail to the chief, ready to take over, and the Vicar Haig will come back in, and everything will be well in Hollywood. There's a story or a picture of Vicki in People magazine, July 25th, 1983, one that I have from Star, LA Star, with Bernie Cornfeld, and he describes his being with her and her husbands. One was an actor, one was a wealthy real estate developer, and she traveled with Bernie Cornfeld. That tells you a lot about her background and the inroads that she had with the the overt organized crime, the mafia, the business offshore dealing swindlers also working for the Central Intelligence Agency and the higher-ups in the government, in the banking fields and security. Exchange Commission, Mr. William Casey and his links to Robert Vesco, the Watergate scandal barely touched the real links of Fred Fielding or Richard Allen or Vesco or Cornfeld and the whole gang that float around and seem to have unlimited power. Now, the newspaper, one of the papers, The Star, on the stands has a very pretty picture of Vicki Morgan. She was very beautiful, long blonde hair, nothing like that hard-looking woman that they have everywhere, as if to say she deserved to die. She's hard and cruel. And in this story, it says Nancy is angry over alleged scandals. Well, you know Nancy was angry. I guess I would be, too. And it tells how she feared for her life. She really shouldn't have had a character like Pancoast around. Goodness knows she should have gone somewhere to her mother's where the son was the day she was killed and gotten out of that place. Pancoast working in an agency that turned her down. What did she expect? There's another story that came out last week about a psychic, not a psychic who is unknown to the literary world. His name is Ernesto Montgomery. And Cliff Leindecker from the Examiner, a fellow who's written a book on child pornography and one on the Nazis in America. Cliff did a book, his first published book, on Ernesto Montgomery. He's a friend of his. And last week, allegedly Ernesto sent him a tape that he made. Vicki Morgan was at his place in Hollywood the day before she was killed, and he told her to get out of where she was, that she was in danger, and that he was afraid something terrible would happen to her. That's what I picked up by the conversation that was repeated in the news about the moving company, that she wanted to get out, away from Pancoast, and was desperate, and this was his last night, and not having a gun there, he just had to do what he did, because evidently she was moving and not going to include him in that process. So she had been to somebody, a long friend, and had told him what was going to happen, or feared for her life, and he feared for her. And he sent this tape or discussion to Cliff. Cliff said he didn't get it. He lives in Florida and didn't get the story of what preceded the day before Vicki Morgan was killed. Now, the way I charted out last week's broadcast and put it on the paper, I made a list of certain important dates that took place from June the 3rd up through September, or even to the end of the year, but there was a time period between June and July and August. It was terribly important for these various forces around Ronald Reagan and the circle that were closing in. Ronald Reagan, I'm meaning Licio Gelli from the Vatican Bank and working with the Italian government, the fascist element. He was at Ronald Reagan's inauguration. Reagan had been in office. He'd been shot and survived. He'd been in office from January 1981 to the spring, summer of 1982, and everything was coming together in a combustion. And I'm going to read some of these events because Vicki Morgan and Alfred Bloomingdale fit right in the middle of them, and see if you can visualize what the people involved were going through or what they're feeling now, and how much there is to come out, and how these people are swirling around like in a cesspool of intrigue, of threats, of murders, of mysterious behavior. I don't know where it'll all lead, and I wouldn't be surprised if Ronald Reagan's last gasp is to declare a war and total war powers by going in Central America and invading there. He's already sent ships there to blockade, and I predicted that he would pull the war off while he was still president to become commander-in-chief. That's why John Lennon was murdered, because he didn't want any anti-war movement or protest, the kind that the Beatles could get if they ever combined, or individually, if John Lennon were to sing. So taking the Vicki Morgan, Alfred Bloomingdale story and putting it in a context of swirling people that I've mentioned on the air for the last year or so, I'm going to just share these dates with you in their chronological order, and then next week, as I did this week charting it out, I'll put them on a form of a calendar, and you'll get that sheet that accompanies this particular information, and just to share these dates because I think they're worth knowing. Now, the scandal around Mr. Donovan, Raymond Donovan, the Secretary of Labor, was horrendous. The man who testified about him, that he was clean, not linked to organized crime, is Mr. Mullen, who's now head of the Drug Enforcement Agency. admitted that he lied and held back, and they said, okay, you can be in charge of the drugs, but don't lie next time. Imagine the desperation and the debts that Ronald Reagan owes to certain people, that he has to continuously make these horrendous appointments that don't make any sense. And of course, the worst of all was Henry Kissinger. So June the 3rd, just last year, a little less than a month over a year, Fred Furino, F-U-R-I-N-O, was a witness to the Donovan case, was missing. June the 3rd, he was missing. He was found dead June the 11th. But there was an 8-day period while Donovan was over in Europe, and the Pope was in Europe, and Reagan was in Europe, and here's his cabinet member, and a particular witness who was missing, just as Roberto Calvi was missing for a time period there from the 10th to the 18th of June. So for all purposes, this Fred Farina was supposed to come home. They lived upstate New York. He was missing. He was found June the 11th, dead in the trunk of the car. A primary witness of the links of Raymond Donovan of New Jersey, close friends with Roy Cohn and Helene Von Damme. Her husband's from New Jersey, now our ambassador to Vienna. Farino was missing, and then he was found in the trunk of a car. The next day, June the 4th, Mr. Shlomo Argoff, S-H-L-O-M-O-A-R-G-O-F. I've had this on many times, from London. He was the Israeli ambassador to London, was shot, and he almost died. He didn't die. He survived. He was taken almost like a basket case back to Israel, and now he's recuperating from the assassination attempt. And one of the first public statements he made was that he didn't approve of Israel invading Lebanon. Now, was he shot because he didn't like their policy and to silence him, or was he shot as the excuse to invade Lebanon by saying they're going to get the PLO when it wasn't the PLO at all? It was an agent provocateur who is living in that area that works with the Israeli army and the Mossad. So he was shot, and that was the excuse 2 days later to invade Lebanon beginning June the 6th. And as it turned out, they had the blessings of Alexander Haig, who was over in Europe, and Ronald Reagan wanted a conference at Versailles, a summit conference without any interruptions. Haig told Israel at that time, go on into Lebanon. Whether Reagan or not, I don't know. June the 6th was a major drug bust in Pakistan. The Moscow radio told the story. The drugs from Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the Golden Arch over there supply Europe and come into the United States, into New York. It's a big source of drugs. It was set up by Henry Kissinger and company at the time that they had the military coup in Pakistan, flowing of massive narcotics. And the narcotic money was tied up, besides the problems with Licio Gelli and Roberto Calvi in Italy. June 6th was an important day because of the Pakistan exposure. Now, June the 7th, the next day after this exposure, Michael Fagan, F-A-G-A-N, was at Buckingham Palace. Now, he didn't go upstairs to the bedroom to see the Queenie for a few days, but he was downstairs checking over the wine closet and knew people at Buckingham Palace. Later, when he goes to the Queen's bedroom, he isn't just going to see what kind of a pink nightgown she has on. He has obviously some kind of message for whoever the powers that be in London. Carlos was reported to be in Beirut, Lebanon, as was Frank Turpel, and Israel was working with the Christian Phalange. The Nazis there, the Israeli party was cooperating to wipe out the PLO, while these people who killed the Jewish athletes in Munich and so forth were in Lebanon, their ally, ganging up against the PLO. Now, June the 10th, jumping 2 days, Roberto Calvi is missing. He will be found dead June 18th. He's the president of Banco Ambrosiano. And as early as 1979, the judges and the courts were getting information, getting ready for a big drug bust in Milan that took place in December of '82. This is June, and it's about 6 months away from there. Roberto Calvi is missing. His bank is the bank building for the largest drug and gun running operation in Europe, in Milan, Stibum, and run by Mr. Henry Arsan, A-R-S-A-N. Roberto Calvi is missing. They're going to take him from Rome to Trieste and Vienna, and then to London, where he will be dead on the 18th. with all the secrets of the Vatican Bank in an attache case. He was supposed to go to court and explain the missing money, the gasoline money, the oil tax money. There was $22 million missing out of Italy from Saudi Arabia, going straight to Argentina, and Vatican money missing. And he was tied into these affairs, and so that the money is in limbo. He is gone, and Mr. Maselli is killed in New York City. Massili. He was the second witness to the Raymond Donovan mob connections to the Genovese and the Gambino. He was gunned down in his car June the 10th, and Fred Farina, the other witness, was found June the 11th in the trunk of a car. So 2 days apart, the primary witnesses to the Raymond Donovan organized crime connections are located and dead, although one had been killed a few days earlier. Ronald Reagan is in London. He's staying at Windsor Castle. This is one of his lifelong dreams with Nancy. Alexander Haig is in London. Alexander Haig is soon to be fired without hardly any warning or hint. Haig is fired, and the stories now are that because he gave Israel the go-ahead at the time of the invasion and made Ronald Reagan furious. And a fellow working with Roberto Calvi, Bruno Tassan Din, Tassan, then DIN, a Calvi associate, was arrested on the basis of currency, stock fraud, and so forth. He was in Switzerland on the way to Italy. Arrested in Bern, Switzerland on June the 12th. The next day was a man who supplied a weapon from Zurich, Switzerland, to shoot the Pope. It was for a job. Now, about this point, the evidence of the Grey Wolves, the Nazis, the right-wing elements around Ajah faded, and he's singing and yelling and learning enough English to say, I love the Pope, I love the Italian jails. There's this arrest in Switzerland, and the story begins to be turned around by Claire Sterling and Michael Ledeen and Marvin Kalb on how the KGB tried to kill the Pope. All of that is dissolving every day in front of our eyes, and I'll do the details on that soon. Pope John Paul was in Argentina, where Licio Gelli was. He's the fascist that worked with Mussolini and fled the country in the 50s, that worked with the P2, the Masonic Nazi organization, the Masonic Lodge, part of the Opus Dei. And he was still down in Argentina. Gelli didn't come back, and he wasn't arrested until September. He's still free, and the Pope is down there in Argentina, where Licio Gelli is. Roberto Calvi still missing when the Pope flies back to Geneva. Raymond Donovan is in Geneva. His two primary witnesses have been murdered. So the Pope can talk about labor, the labor meeting and solidarity, and Donovan can talk about labor, both of them involved with scandals hanging over their heads and acting every bit the statesman, while their witnesses are, one's missing and two have been killed. Donovan's two primary witnesses are killed, and Roberto Calvi is missing. Whether the Pope knew he would be hung or not, I don't know. Edwin Wilson is over there in Italy, in Zurich. He's going to be arrested in Zurich. And King Khaled, Khaled of Saudi Arabia, dies. Alexander Haig and George Bush fly to the funeral. Saudi Arabia owes it's $22 billion. I'm sorry, I didn't want to exaggerate. $22 million. It's $22 billion of gas tax money that was supposed to go to Italy, that is linked to Licio Gelli, who's still in Argentina, to the Argentine Nazis, the Opus Dei, Roberto Calvi, and so forth. King Khaled is dead, the Saudi Arabian, just at the time of the scandal in his country. Ronald Reagan comes home from his visit with the castle with the king and queen and flies directly from London to Houston, Texas, and says, we will have the Republican convention in Dallas, Texas in 1984. A real slap in the face for the place where John Kennedy was murdered, that the Republicans on that year are going to have it, or any other year, in Dallas, Texas. It's as arrogant as having Henry Kissinger appointed to the position he had this past week after the many, many years research that Seymour Hersh has done about him and the scandals of Henry Kissinger to the various fascist regimes. Now, Edwin Wilson's over in Europe. The gun that Edwin Wilson, Frank Turple, obviously had worked with Ajah, has been picked up. The fellow who had the gun is identified, who sold it to Ajah, and Edwin Wilson, who headed the CIA assassination teams involved with the Bay of Pigs, who worked with E. Howard Hunt and Richard Nixon, and Theodore Shackley up through the Kennedy assassination and so forth. He's arrested, and he's going to be flown to the United States of America. Now, why was he arrested if he did such a good job? I think for the same reason. So much was coming down, they didn't want to leave him there to be tortured, to be drugged, to be taken to the Soviet Union. They wanted to make sure he was here in one piece, which he is, and he's very quiet. You don't hear a thing about Edwin Wilson recently. Now, taken captive in Israel, June 17th, was one of the members of the team that masterminded the murder at the Olympic Games, and they picked up one of those assassins that had worked with Richard Nixon, the CIA, the Nazis in Germany, and that was part of the Lebanon sweep. They picked him up. Same day, June 17th, the secretary, Roberto Calvi, working on the fourth floor of Banco Ambrosiano, the headquarters of the world's largest narcotics and drug running, just about in the center of Milan, in the bank of the branch that affects the Vatican and the monarchy and the royal families in Europe, the Banco Ambrosiano. The secretary of Calvi goes flying out the fourth window. Graziella Teresa Croce, Crocher. And that same night that she goes out, the next day, Calvi, for all purposes, he was left the hotel and was kidnapped and taken or driven to the Blackfriars Bridge, where he was killed probably before he was hung at the bridge. That night that he's taken away is the night that Michael Fagan is in Buckingham Palace with Queenie. 340 rooms, 600 help, and he manages to go in and sit on the edge of her bed and leave there, and he's just taken in custody for a couple of weeks, and then he's out doing his punk rock. So the night that Calvi's really, for all purposes, done in, because he's found the next early morning, his secretary goes out the window, Fagan's at Buckingham Palace, Reagan has been to Houston, Texas, and flown back, and William Arco was arrested June the 18th, the same day that Calvi was hung. Arco was arrested. Arco was hired by Michael Sindona. Sindona was the Vatican banker. When he was put into jail for the $45 million failure of the Franklin National Bank and also many millions for his Italian banks, when he was put into jail, he was also charged with arranging to have a judge murdered in Italy who was investigating his case. And the man he sent to do the murder was William Arco, who was temporarily in American jail and was released and was living in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. So he was picked up the same day that Calvi was found, and June the 18th, that very day that Calvi was located. Now, they've been looking for him for 10 days. The money for Vicki Morgan was cut off from Alfred Bloomingdale's paychecks to Vicki Morgan, $18,000 a month, $10,000 to $18,000 a month. Now, evidently the cash wasn't coming in from the pizza parlor, and she sued, and she expected this other income for the rest of her life. She had a fancy standard of living. But being with Bernie Cornfeld and the links of Vesco and these various kings and Roberto Calvi, a hunk of this money, these big wads of money, comes from narcotics or CIA or extortion or blackmail. But when Roberto Calvi was hanging, the $22 billion from Saudi Arabia was under question, the $2.4 billion of the Vatican with the 10 dummy fronts in Panama was being investigated. Vatican Bank links to Banco Ambrosiano. And that very day that Calvi is hanging, Vicki's money is cut off, June the 18th. She's not going to do anything till July to file suit about her servicing Alfred Bloomingdale's needs and the sadomasochism. July the 9th, she files a suit wanting the support that she was promised, and then Alfred Bloomingdale will be dead in August. John Hinckley Jr., June 21st, was found not guilty by reason of insanity. He was part of the American Nazi Party, the Posse Comitatus. He hired Edward Bennett Williams for his attorney. Williams was also the attorney for Robert Vesco, the partner of Bernie Cornfeld, who lived with Vicki Morgan. He was attorney for John Connolly, for Richard Helms, for the Central Intelligence Agency. John Hinckley Jr. was found not guilty. The Pope, John Paul II, offered to help find the assassination plot against his life, and he begins to get involved in Aja. And when he offers to help in the attempt to find out what happened, Aja begins to turn it to blame the KGB. This is June 21st when the tables turn. It was also for the Senate hearings, June 23rd, that the truth about Jimmy Hoffa's murder came out, how he was murdered and how it was set up Of course, nobody's been charged, and the people that did it are still alive. June 24th, Reagan, from the House of Representatives, offered $50 million to rebuild Lebanon. Now, I don't think Haig was fired because he told Israel to go into Lebanon, because if Reagan were really mad, he wouldn't have put $50 million into rebuilding Lebanon. You don't offer $50 million right away. So one of the things they wanted to do, the Jamal family and Ronald Reagan and the State Department, was to use Lebanon as a military base like Israel for the invasion against the Soviet Union someday. And they also wanted to get, in exchange for that, get rid of the PLO that were living there and test the Israeli weapons. A lot of things were accomplished at one time, and as a reward, they got $50 million from our Congress. June 25th, the next day after that, Jack Anderson wrote a story on how Edwin Wilson was arrested in Switzerland, and he had like 16 or 18 million on him, and he was promised that he would have protection in the Dominican Republic. But when he got there, he was kept outside the airport and wasn't allowed to land. As a gift for that, just a few days later, June 25th is when Edwin Wilson went through the Dominican Republic and put on a plane to New York. And 6 days later, July the 6th, President Antonio Guzman was dead in the Dominican Republic with a bullet to his head. I think you'll agree this was quite a time, and as I say, I'll chart it out for you next week. Now, Alexander Haig, the day after the story of the Dominican Republic and Edwin Wilson, Alexander Haig was fired. He came home from London, and as soon as he got home, the vicar was fired. And right away, George Shultz was made Secretary of State. Shultz came from Bechtel Corporation that helped build Saudi Arabia and many other countries. I don't know what they do. The airports, the buildings, the industrial buildings come out of Bechtel, Stephen Bechtel, and their company in San Francisco. Shultz was no new-timer in Washington. He worked for Crook Richard Nixon. He had Secretary of Labor job, just like Raymond Donovan, with the Teamsters, the mob under him, and close to John Connolly and Raymond Donovan and Jimmy Hoff and Fred Fielding, Richard Allen, and Robert Fesco. He was no new stranger to the whole team. And June 28th, Mr. Donovan was cleared completely of links to organized crime. As I say, his primary witnesses are dead. He's over in Europe with the Pope. Calvi's hanging. Everything is clear. Now, July the 3rd, by July, Vicki Morgan was threatened that her money would be cut off, and she retaliated and said, "I'll expose the whole group." That's in the book Make Believe that I mentioned last week or the week before. Vicki Morgan is going to expose the Reagans and the whole group. They've cut off her money. Where did her money come from, and how many people were dependent upon Roberto Calvi and the organized crime, drug-running, gun-running money? Her money was cut off. He wasn't dead yet, and July 3rd, she sued Alfred Bloomingdale and wanted her money. And as I say, July the 6th, the president of the Dominican Republic was killed. The Pan Am plane from Florida to Las Vegas crashed July 9th. There were conflicting guest lists. There was a drug enforcer agent on there. There's a mysterious story about the plane that crashed over New Orleans, and quickly they made a settlement and they took full responsibility and said, "We're guilty." So we don't know the list of people on the plane or who might have been killed, who was important on that plane that could have linked. The way they hushed it up and accepted the guilt so quickly, you never heard another word about that flight. It was a Pan Am flight from Florida to Las Vegas. Now, Alfred Bloomingdale on July the 9th was sued, and he would be dead by August the 24th. I don't know whether it was a Jack Ruby cancer, one of these 3-week cancers, because he got sick, and shortly after that he died very quickly, yet he had been on Ronald Reagan's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board in June, so he obviously had to be well and have a clearance for the appointment at that time. Now, Roy Cohn was hired as an attorney for Alfred Bloomingdale. July the 9th, when Vicki Morgan sued him, Roy Cohn was to represent Bloomingdale on July the 9th. And July the 12th, just 3 days later, he takes an airplane and goes to Monte Carlo, where Roy Cohn has dinner with Michael Pochna, Pochna. He's the father of Prince Rainier's attorney, and soon Rainier is to become a widower. These are a lot of names and dates to remember. I don't expect you to remember them all, so I'll type them up for you to get an idea of what was going on in this time period. Because in the middle of all that were Vicki Morgan and Alfred Bloomingdale, and soon he's dead and she's dead, and Ronald Reagan is hoping that some of these sordid stories will be bottled up just as the primary witnesses died, and then Edwin Wilson's escapades went off the headlines. I'll be back with more of this next week. This is Mae Brussell on KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California.